I want to bring up this quote of Meister Eckhart. Um, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. Can you talk about how this statement aligns with the non-dual understanding that awareness is not separate from what it perceives?
Okay. Can we go back to the analogy of the actor to explain this? Beautiful, beautiful statement from Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart was one of the great non-dual masters in the Western tradition, the mystical Christian tradition. Let's take the analogy of an actor. Yeah. Take an actor, John Smith, who plays the part of King Lear. So John Smith goes to his theatre. King Lear is a suit of clothes that John Smith puts on, and a series of lines and actions. Mm-hmm. So John Smith, before he goes to the theatre, he knows himself as John Smith. He goes to the theatre, he puts on puts on the suit of clothes, and he adopts a series of lines and activities and relationships. And he seems, as a result, to become King Lear. Not really King Lear, he's always only John Smith, but he now seems to be the person, mm-hmm. King Lear. In this analogy, John Smith represents awareness, and King Lear represents the finite mind. So awareness has clothed itself in thoughts and perceptions and seems to have become a finite mind. John Smith has clothed himself in King Lear's thoughts and feelings and actions, and seems to have become the King of England. Yeah. Now, when King Lear, King Lear knows himself, or seems to know himself, as King Lear. John mm-hmm. Smith knows himself as John Smith. Yeah. Now, if King Lear wants to know himself, wants to know who he is, mm-hmm. he has to turn his attention away from everything that is not essential to him. He's obviously not his thoughts, because his thoughts are continually coming and going. He's obviously not his emotions, because his emotions are continually changing. He's obviously not his sensations and perceptions. So King Lear begins to trace his way back through the layers of his experience, discarding everything that is not essential to him, because only that which is essential to him qualifies as his self, his essential self. But King Lear traces his way back through the layers of his experience, and at some stage there is this recognition, I am John Smith. Mm-hmm. So King Lear knows himself through John Smith. The self of King Lear is John Smith. And it's not King Lear that has the experience of being John Smith. Mm-hmm. Only John Smith has the experience of being John Smith.
Yes.
So King Lear knows himself as John Smith through John Smith. Now, in the opposite direction, how does in what way does John Smith mm-hmm. know that he is the self of King Lear? It's in exactly the same way. When King Lear is on stage mm-hmm. acting, John Smith knows himself as the very being of King Lear, because mm-hmm. John Smith is all there is to King Lear. Yeah. So it's through the knowledge, I am John Smith, mm-hmm. is both John Smith's knowledge of himself and King Lear's knowledge of himself. It's the same experience. Mm-hmm. The only identity, the only I that is there is the I of John Smith, the only identity, the only self, if we can call it a self. So it's exactly the same. If we trace our way back through the layers of our experience to and go all the way back, discarding everything that is not essential to us, we arrive simply at being, or being aware, or pure awareness itself. In religious terms, God's being. So we know ourself as God's being. The being in us is God's being. The self in us is the only self there is, the being, infinite being, God's being. It is the only self, if we can call it a self, or being there is. So the self that stands at the heart of the individual, and the self, we can call it a self that awareness is, that the being that stands at the heart of the individual, and the being that is the nature of awareness, that they're the same being. The space in this room, which seems to be a temporary, finite, limited space, is the same space as the vast, unlimited space of the universe. If the space in this room were to give itself a name, it would call itself I. The space of the universe were to give itself a name, it would call itself I. Mm-hmm. That's the same I. If King Lear were to give himself a name, he'd call himself I. If John Smith were to give himself a name, he'd call himself I. But those are not two different I's. There's not one being for John Smith and another being for King Lear. Yeah. One I for John Smith and another I for King Lear. It's the same I. So the I that King Lear knows himself to be, and the I that John Smith knows himself to be, are the same I. If God, whatever you conceive God to be, the absolute, the ultimate, if God were to say something true about itself, the first thing it would say, and in fact the only thing it could say accurately, is I am. I am represents infinite awareness's knowledge of itself, the knowing of being, the awareness of being. We express that by saying I am. But if God were able, or you don't like the word God, if infinite being were able to say something about itself, it would just say I am. Now, what about the individual? If I asked you to say something, what is your most fundamental experience? Before you experience a thought or a feeling or a sensation or a perception, what is your fundamental experience of yourself? It's the experience of being, which, if you were to express it in words, you would express it by saying, I am. Now, the experience to which you refer when you say I am, and the experience to which God or infinite being would refer if it were able to say I am, is the same experience. In other words, the I am, or the experience to which we refer when we say I am, is God's being shining in us as our very own being. That's what Meister Eckhart meant.
So beautiful, so beautiful. Truly, truly, it just, like, even while you say it, it just, the experience of I am just knows that that's the truth.
Yes. The awareness of being, which we express with the words I am, is the only experience that is absolutely true. And the reason for that is that it's the only experience we have that is not mediated through the finite mind. For instance, your experience of the world is mediated through your finite mind, through perception, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling. So you can't be sure, we can't be sure, that what we're seeing out there as the world is really the world as it is in itself, because we're seeing it through the lens of sense perception. In fact, we can be absolutely certain that the reality of the world is not how it appears to be, because our sense perceptions render the world in a way that is consistent with their own limitations. Just like when you look at white snow through orange-tinted glasses, you see orange snow. So this is true of all experience. All experience is mediated through the finite mind, and as a result shares its limitations. So all knowledge and experience is relative to the finite mind through which it is known. The only experience there is that is not mediated through the finite mind is the knowing of being, the awareness of being. And for that reason, I am is said to be the highest truth, the highest, the absolute truth. Can I take this further?
Please, please.
The knowledge I am is even higher than the knowledge God is. For this reason, that God would never say of itself, God is. God would say of itself, I am. It's only we, the finite mind, that says God is, like we say the tree is, or the mountain is, or the sky is, and God is. When we say God is, we stand apart from God as a temporary finite mind, and we say God is.
Mm-hmm.
God is the object of our experience. But in God's infinite being, there's no room for anything other than itself. In infinite being, there's no room for a finite object or a finite self. But ultimately, the knowledge God is false. It's blasphemy. Because in order to say God is, we must set ourselves up as a being apart from God. And by doing so, we deny God's infinite being. It's truer to say I am. Why? Because I am expresses God's experience of itself. And if God is the reality, if God is the religious name for the totality, the absolute, the reality, then only its knowledge of itself can be true knowledge. Therefore, I am is the highest expression of truth in the English language. And it's for this reason that Meister Eckhart prayed to God to rid him of God. And that was considered blasphemy at the time, but it wasn't blasphemy. He realized in that considering God to be God, he was setting himself up as a being apart from God's being, and that is blasphemy. But he realized that to say God is denying God's infinite being, is setting himself up as a being apart from God's being. He realized that was blasphemy. He realized this was the last barrier between dissolving completely into God's being. And so he prayed to God to take God away from him so that he could stand revealed as God's being. Not knowing God's being, but being God's being.
And
the Buddhists say this in their own way. If you meet the Buddha on the path, kill him. It's the same understanding.